All right, so this is now the week 2 lecture. Um, we're going to start off talking about the cell, what makes up the cell, and how it does various processes. So remember, the cell is the most basic form of life, and the cell itself is made up of organelles. Important thing to remember is that there are single-celled organisms that exist. We see it a lot in bacteria, and there's protozoa, there's fungi, there's things of those natures that are single-celled organisms. Organelles within cells are kind of like you could think of them as kind of the part of the cell that does various things. Almost think of it like a miniature human body, in the sense that each part has a different job and they interact together in order to keep the cell functioning. Okay. In eukaryotic cells, which are the type of cell that humans and a lot of animals are made up of, there's always going to be 3 parts. There's going to be a membrane, a nucleus, and the cytoplasm. Okay. Now there's prokaryotic cells, which we're not really going to discuss here, but prokaryotic cells, we see certain bacteria, various other organisms that are not the same complexity as an animal, but they actually don't have nucleuses, but they still have the genetic material that's housed in the nucleus. So anyway, for eukaryotic cells, which again, they're going to always have a cell membrane, a nucleus, and cytoplasm. The cell membrane, if we think about that, is going to be a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so it's if we break down that name, it's a bilayer. So there's 2 layers to it. Okay. Next, a phospholipid. What's a phospholipid? Well, it's a lipid that's bound to a phosphate group. Okay, so phosphate is another molecule. These phosphate groups bind to these lipids, and they actually get arranged in this bilayer where the hydrophobic, or the parts of the cell that don't like to interact with water, they face each other. Okay, and that's actually the lipid component of the cell. And the hydrophilic component, which is the phosphate group, actually faces the water. That phosphate actually loves interacting with water, and it does so very well. So what you see in a cell membrane is almost like, you'll see it often drawn as kind of a circle, little tails, and then another circle. Okay, where the circles are the phosphate heads and the tails kind of like the lipid legs that don't like to interact with water. And this is a biochemical concept called the hydrophobic effect, which is actually caused by the fact that literally all biochemistry should be assumed to occur within water. Okay, so again, the cell membrane, 2 layers of these phospholipids, where the fat component doesn't interact with water, doesn't face the water, and the phosphate component faces the water. The cell membrane is really in charge of permeability of the cell, and that's to say how stuff comes in and out of the cell. Okay, certain things can go through the cell membrane very easily. Other things cannot go through the membrane without expending energy, utilizing transport proteins, anything of that nature. It needs help. Okay. So within the cell membrane, which is going to be the outermost layer, you can almost, I don't want to say cell wall, because cell wall is actually a completely different organelle that we don't have in humans. It's something that typically plants and bacteria have. But it's the outer protective layer of the cell. Everything in the cell is contained within the membrane. It's either literally a part of the membrane or inside of the membrane boundaries. That whole space is then going to be filled with fluid and organelles and various, ions, enzymes, proteins, things of that nature. And that whole general space is generally referred to as the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm of the cell you can kind of think of as the guts of the cell. It's going to be the location for certain interactions within the body, like a big thing that I believe we'll discuss later on, glycolysis, which is one of the most basic forms of creating energy in the body, is done in the cytoplasm. Okay. So let's talk about some of the other organelles. So ribosomes. Ribosomes are a protein complex that has kind of two components. It's going to have proteins, but it's also going to have RNA molecules. We'll talk about DNA and RNA a little bit later and more in depth in other chapters. But if you remember from the first lecture, I talked about nucleic acids. Well, that's what the Na represents in RNA. It is a nucleic acid, okay? Kind of similar idea to an amino acid, but they function very differently, and they play very different roles. The ribosome, though, its job is to take instructions from the DNA in the form of messenger RNA, and it's going to make proteins based on the DNA, okay? And these proteins are how all bodily functions are carried out, okay? These proteins can be structural, so we could be talking about parts of things like collagen, which is a connective tissue that's very important for structure within the body. It could be enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that basically cause reactions to occur quicker. They can stop reactions from occurring. They can do all sorts of things that actually cause the body to function regularly. Next, the endoplasmic reticulum is one of the two, I guess you could say, transport networks within the protein. The ER is responsible for transporting proteins that are synthesized by ribosomes that are on the ER. Now, there's what's called smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulums. Rough endoplasmic reticulum under a microscope looks like it has the grainy little dots all over it. That's because there's ribosomes that are actually built in to the side of the endoplasmic reticulum. Not all ribosomes, though, are on the endoplasmic reticulum, and not all endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes. Okay? In fact, the smooth ER plays a big role in the creation of lipids. Okay? Because lipids, while generally the term fat has a negative connotation in it, lipids actually play a big role in a lot of bodily processes. Next, we'll skip over vesicles because I'll talk about that in a minute, but the Golgi apparatus is the second transport network. You can think of the endoplasmic reticulum as transporting things within the cell, right? The Golgi apparatus is actually the transport network that kind of boxes up proteins or various other molecules for them to be secreted from the cell and moved elsewhere. So sometimes, kind of like chaperone proteins are attached. Those are proteins that help, make sure that the packaged protein's going where it needs to go. You can kind of think of the Golgi apparatus as the post office for the cell. Next, vesicles. So within the cell, we'll have small packages, I guess you could call them, and they're sacs that are surrounded by a membrane, and they transport substances throughout the cell. Vesicles are really important in glands. They're very important in neurons. Okay, and we'll talk about why later on. Mitochondria. Everybody's going to know what mitochondria does. It helps. It's one of the main places that energy is formed in a usable form within the body. What else? Some of the other big ones. There's microfilaments and microtubules. So we see those two things being used to help move substances and organelles around the cytoplasm. You can think about them as almost like muscles within the cell. In fact, microfilaments and microtubules play a major role in how our actual muscles function as well. Then we see, so there's going to be the nucleus, right? The nucleus houses all of our DNA, and it's going to have two different kind of components to it. There's going to be the nuclear envelope, which is a membrane that separates everything in the nucleus from everything in the cytoplasm. And there's the nucleolus, which really is the area within the nucleus that is responsible for making ribosomes, making various, making the RNAs and things of that nature. So moving back to the cell membrane, right? The cell membrane, as I said before, is selectively permeable, all right? Certain things can go straight through it, and certain things require, transport proteins require an escort, and typically that's going to require energy. And we have two ways to divide these things. There's passive and active transports. So passive transport does not require any energy, and it allows substances to move in and out of the cell freely. Typically, this is going to occur based on diffusion. And diffusion's premise is that things go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay? You can kind of think about it as a crowd of people. If you have, a very large space and you have 100 people only crowded into half of it, people are eventually going to kind of spread out a little bit. They're going to disperse. Nobody wants to be crowded in a space when they don't have to be. So that we see that a lot with a good example is like sodium in water. It's really good for this, and it likes to diffuse across cell membranes. Then there's active mechanisms. So I mentioned before, typically this goes against the concentration gradient. It's going to require ATP, and ATP is the energy that our body actually uses. It's adenosine triphosphate. Again, notice phosphate. It's incredibly important within our body. All right, it plays a role in a lot of reactions. It's cell membrane. It's a high energy material. It plays a role in DNA. It plays a role in RNA. It's a very important substance within our body. active mechanisms are going to be endocytosis, exocytosis, there's phagocytosis, pinocytosis, and those last two you typically see as the description of what like immune cells that engulf bacteria. That's typically how those are described, whereas endo and exocytosis is the general process in which the cell brings in larger molecules or essentially pushes out larger molecules. Next, we're going to start to talk about the cell cycle, which is, the process of the cell dividing to make more cells. This is called mitosis. So the way mitosis works, you have one initial cell, the mother cell, and it's going to go through this process where the DNA strands, because DNA is two different strands of material that are complementary. Okay, so if we look down here, this is an example of what a DNA strand looks like, right? DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. So nucleic acid that we see used on DNA are these letters that you see. There's 4 types used in DNA. There's 4 types used in RNA. All right. There's slight differences between DNA and RNA, especially when we talk about the letter T, which actually changes to a U for DNA, or for RNA, sorry. And these are complementary. So C is always going to bind to G, and A is always going to bind to T, okay? A can also bind to the U that I also just mentioned. But you'll see here it's 2 strands, right? What happens is essentially throughout this process, these bonds that connect the 2 strands, they get separated, okay? So that leaves 2 strands kind of floating about on their own, right? Then we have a piece of RNA show up. That RNA essentially is going to make a copy, and we end up with 2 complete copies of the DNA. Then what happens is the cell then starts to grow, create some more organelles, more cytoplasm, and then it actually starts to cleavage, which means it folds in on itself and eventually splits into 2 daughter cells that have 1 full copy of the DNA itself. Okay, so you start off with a mother cell that copies its DNA. The copied DNA then gets reformed into 2 separate nuclei. Other organelles and cytoplasm enlarge. They also are, there's more created, and then the 2 cells split to form 2 daughter cells that each have 1 full copy of DNA, and these cells function normally. Okay. Moving on, talking about the most basic classifications for reactions within the cell. There's catabolic and there's anabolic reactions. The 2 ways to describe them, they're exact opposites. Anabolic reactions are reactions that build. They build. Okay, so this could be the process of building a new protein. It could be the process of expanding, the cell wall, things of that nature. Then there's catabolism. Catabolic processes are ones in which the body is actually breaking something down. This happens a lot. We see catabolic reactions occurring in like the bone, for instance. You have osteoblasts versus osteoclasts constantly remodeling the bone to help it withstand the average stresses that it undergoes. Okay. Next, we have to consider DNA itself. So DNA is inherited from the parents. I believe we'll discuss it more in depth later, but essentially, as I mentioned, DNA is made up of nucleic acids in a double helix because there's two strands. Okay. During mitosis, they split apart. RNA replicates them, and then they are sent their own ways, and then they reattach with the complementary strand. All right. Because again, A in DNA, A can only bind with T, C can only bind with G. And it's a couple different reasons, but a big part of it is how they're shaped, as well as some things with charge, electrical charge on them. So DNA and RNA, which are nucleic acids, play a major role in the formation of protein, which, as I mentioned before, protein is the absolute driver for all bodily functions. Okay, they're enzymes, they make up structures. Proteins are hormones. They have almost every type of role. The antibodies are a type of protein. Our muscle has, there's myosin, there's actin, troponin, tropomyosin, titin, and there's more than just that. That makes up just one muscle cell. So there's so many proteins that all play very different roles within the body. And they're how the body actually how organs carry out their functions, and it's how the DNA essentially causes everything to happen. So when the DNA is read, a protein gets made from the DNA, and that protein is going to exist in a certain way, and that certain way tells it how to do its job, and that ends up leading to, the easiest things to see is how people look different, how people are taller than others, things of that nature. So the DNA really is behind the scenes of everything that happens in the body, and it does what it needs to do based on the proteins that it has the codes to make. Okay, so that is going to be the end of the week 2 lecture.